The main claim that I'm responding to is that pop culture has desensitized America's youth and numbed its reaction to violence. My opponent's first claim was that rap artists create a skewed perception of ideal lifestyles that children aspire to grow into. I found this to be pretty non-convincing because while she makes this argument, it seems more of an opinion. She doesn't provide any statistical evidence that this is occurring, and there's no proof presented that it actually causes desensitization. She uses a minor article later in her presentation about rap artists and hero worship and things like that. However, the article is from 1998, a period in which hip-hop was known for being about the content being gang affiliation and stuff like that. Over the past 15 years, hip-hop's evolved a lot. Artists such as Lupe Fiasco, POS, they're using hip-hop to kind of provide social commentary. So that's one of the things that I feel as if maybe my opponent doesn't necessarily have a good understanding of hip-hop, and without understanding a complex genre, you really can't make that argument, especially considering there's no statistical evidence presented. Her second claim is that cartoons and shows teach children to treat violence as funny by passing violence on as comedy. She uses an article titled "Cartoon Violence and Aggression in Youth" by S.J. Kirsch. But what Kirsch is arguing is that we trivialize violence. Once again, I'm not sure that you can make the inference that by a Looney Tunes cartoon is going to cause an increase in violence or desensitization. So that's one of those things that's really important. I think that a child is going to develop a deeper understanding of violence from being pushed down in the playground as opposed to watching an episode of SpongeBob or something like that. And so that's one of those things. Once again, she doesn't provide any statistical proof. There's no kind of evidence that that cartoons are causing violence. She does provide one of these things that says that there's more violence in primetime cartoons than there is in primetime drama, but I think that context is needed. The violence presented in an episode of CSI is going to be a lot different than the violence presented on a Nickelodeon show. And I think that you need to distinguish those two, and just because you know, that kind of playful violence, like I said in Looney Tunes, is occurring, doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase in numbness in terms of what we feel in terms of empathy. And one of those things that's really interesting is, as pop culture has exploded, you would imagine that the crime rate would increase according to the claims that she's making. However, in 1992 there were 786 violent crimes per 100,000 people. In 2012 there was 386 crimes per 100,000 people, and that's according to an FBI stat sheet. That's a huge decrease, pretty much cut in half. And you would think, along with both her first and second claims in terms of hip-hop music and cartoons, obviously both of those mediums have increased. I mean, it's becoming more and more of our lives. Yet there's no increase in violence, and that's kind of interesting to me. It would lead me to believe that this isn't occurring. Her third claim is that she focuses on video games and that we're teaching children that killing is normal and that video games are becoming more and more violent. Once again, I'm not seeing any kind of evidence. Video games are becoming more and more a part of our daily life, whether that's through cell phones, PlayStations, whatever. But necessarily, are they becoming increasingly violent? I'm not sure. I was unable to provide find any kind of research, and one of the things that's interesting is a Texas A&M professor by the name of Craig Ferguson. He's even arguing that the research is so new into video games, into modern video games, that it's not very well done. It's very difficult to find people to agree, because one of the arguments being made is that children might be more aggressive, so they're going after Call of Duty because they're more aggressive. And one of the interesting points here is that a game like Call of Duty, my opponent mentions both Call of Duty and Halo 3. Both of those games are rated mature by the SRB, which means you have to be 17 years old to purchase them. You have to provide your ID when you purchase them. And so even then, they're not presented for children. Do we blame an 8-year-old for seeing Django Unchained, or do we blame the parent? I think that's one of those arguments that needs to be made. So my conclusion is that while violent video games are probably not going to be good for kids, an episode of CSI is not going to be great for a 6-year-old. There's no statistics that say that violence is increasing. Once again, the FBI stat sheet shows that violence is actually decreasing significantly. And even then, this violent material is, there's policies in place to make sure that kids do not have access to it. That's it. Thanks.
All right, the secondary points are labeled, the main points labeled, structural things are all fine. Most of your argument consists of claims about the inadequacy of the advocate's evidence, and I think you could do some good presses on a couple of those points. There are a couple of places where you also present some counter evidence. There's an assertion about the change in hip-hop since 1998. You do try to suggest a couple of examples of artists who are using it differently. I just think that the advocate made a very general argument here. You're making a general argument in response. I don't know that either one of you is getting any traction on that particular point. On the second point on violence, I think that you're a little bit better off because... Oh, I'm so glad that went off afterwards. I think that you're arguing, like you challenge the advocate's evidence because the evidence doesn't really talk about causality. It talks about how people are going to perceive the violence, and I thought that that was a pretty reasonable point. And then you say that kids, what was it? They have a different kinds of experience with the different types of violence. I thought that was your assertion, and I think you needed some evidence to back it up. The hypothetical example of CSI violence versus Nickelodeon violence, I think, is okay, but like I said, I think that this is a place where if you had some evidence on this point in light of the vague evidence that the advocate's presenting, it would be a lot more convincing. The general argument that you make here is the one that we'd heard earlier. Look, we've had substantial declines in violent crime. As the pop culture has gotten more the way the advocate is worried about it, it seems to run, it seems to be a sign that this is a contradictory or it's counterintuitive that these things must be related to each other, and I think that you make that argument pretty clear. Okay, well, I think we're kind of out of time. I don't want to start another speech now, so we'll call it a day, and we'll try and get through a whole bunch more on